The morning in New York, a chilly breeze weaves through the empty stands of the small practice court on Randall's Island. John McEnroe, 66 years old, steps slowly onto the court, holding an old, worn-out racket, his eyes following the faint sunlight falling on the white lines. Alone, he tosses the ball up, hits it lightly, the sound echoing in the stillness, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat bridging past and present. Each swing is a memory, a chime echoing the glorious days of youth. He was once the bad boy of tennis, the rebel who made both America and England love and fear him. Over 40 years ago, he conquered the world with inimitable genius. 7 Grand Slam singles titles, 9 doubles titles, 170 weeks as world number 1, the legendary 1,984 season, with 82 wins and only 3 losses, a record no one has matched. McEnroe turned tennis into art. His volleys like a dance, his slices like soft brushstrokes, his feel for the ball as delicate as a violinist playing a melody. On the court, he wasn't just an athlete. He was an icon, the one who brought the U.S. Davis Cup back to glory, who made his rivalries with Borg, Connors, and Lendl legendary. That glory, seemingly eternal, eventually left him. Now, each of McEnroe's movements is slow, his spine stiff, his neck aching from decades of strain. The arm that once painted perfect shots now trembles slightly when gripping the racket. The fiery eyes have grown calm, deep, carrying the weight of years of struggle and regret. As the ball bounces off the court, he pauses, listening to its echo like a reminder of time. Fame fades. Applause dies. McEnroe once shouted at the universe to be heard. And now, the universe returns silence. A silence that makes him realize he lived too fast, too fiercely, and forgot the simplest thing, peace. In the hazy dawn of New York, his shadow stretches long across the court, blending with memories and solitude. He bends to pick up the ball, looks up at the gray sky, exhales deeply, and in that moment, a question arises, gnawing like a scar that never heals. When the glory has faded, who still listens to the beating of his heart? John McEnroe was born in 1,959 inches Wiesbaden, West Germany, while his father, John McEnroe Sr., served in the U.S. Air Force. A few months old, the family returned to New York, settling in a modest home in Douglaston, Queens, where he would spend his childhood caught between two worlds, his father's expectations and his mother's silence. In that house, love was never spoken aloud. His father, disciplined and strict, believed success came only from never being satisfied. His mother, Kay, gentle but distant, was always present but rarely showed emotion. "My dad never said he was proud of me," McEnroe once shared. "Even when I won." For a sensitive child, that silence hurt more than any scolding. Young John excelled in school, was bright, gifted in art and sports, but never felt good enough. An A grade earned only his father's "try harder next time." A win in a school match brought only his mother's faint smile before she turned away. Love in the McEnroe family wasn't hugs. It was reminders to strive harder, always harder. The boy grew up amid comparisons and silence, learning to hide his true feelings behind a cold mask. In class, McEnroe wasn't the standout, but he carried an unpredictable energy, a mix of intelligence, stubbornness, and solitude. Friends recall him as a kid who never gave up, even in a game of paperball tossing. The quiet craving for recognition, to be seen, fueled a fire within McEnroe that he would spend a lifetime learning to control. At 8, his father took him to the Port Washington Tennis Academy, the prestigious tennis school in Long Island. The first racket his father bought was both a gift and a command. "Play your best." The boy stepped onto the court, gripping the racket tightly, his eyes filled with fear of failure, fear of being forgotten. But when the first ball hit the strings, the sharp, resonant sound felt like something inside him being set free. Tennis became the only place McEnroe could express what words couldn't. Anger, longing, loneliness, and the pride no one acknowledged. He didn't play to win, he played to be heard existing. On the practice court, McEnroe's shots were different. Uncalculated, inimitable, instinctive, fluid, and defiant. His coach recalled, "The kid had a special feel for the ball, like he could hear its heartbeat." But it was also there that John learned to turn pain into strength. Each criticism or scolding was met with harder, sharper shots. The eyes of that 10-year-old held something too big for his age, a yearning to be loved, seen, recognized. While other kids played, he practiced for hours until his hands bled. When others cried over a loss, he threw his racket, shouted, then fell into a chilling silence. Tennis wasn't just a game, it was the battlefield of that boy's soul. The older he got, the more McEnroe realized rebellion was the only way to make people notice him. When criticized for his fiery temper, he reacted even more fiercely, as if anger was his only language. Under the lights of the Port Washington courts, that 12-year-old boy learned his first life lesson. If the world won't listen, make them hear you at any cost. And from there, the first wound formed, a crack between talent and peace, between the desire to be loved and the fear of being forgotten. Years later, as a legend, McEnroe looked back on his childhood and said, "I don't know who I'd be if my dad had just said, 'You did great.' Maybe I'd be happier, but I sure as hell wouldn't have played tennis like I was raging at the whole world." In the dim light of that first practice court, young John McEnroe found his sanctuary, where the sound of the ball echoed like proof he existed. But in that same place, under cold white lights and the dry thud of the ball, he began a long journey of a lonely soul. A journey of a man who would spend his life trying to be good enough in others' eyes, forgetting how to love himself. And that first court's light, brilliant yet forlorn, became the start of a loneliness that would stretch across his life. At 18, John McEnroe stepped into a world millions dreamed of and one that would devour his youth. In 1977, the lanky kid from Queens stunned England by reaching the Wimbledon semifinals as an amateur, the hallowed temple of world tennis. Everything happened too fast, too big. His name hit the front pages of major newspapers, dubbed America's prodigy, a genius out of nowhere. But right after that glory, the boos and jeers began. The English audience, revering decorum, couldn't stomach the young man who glared, argued with umpires, and threw his racket. They didn't see a scared kid. They saw arrogance, insolence. McEnroe didn't know that day, stepping onto Wimbledon's grass, he wasn't just starting a career, he was signing a lifelong sentence, to be misunderstood by the world. "I never meant to offend anyone," he later recalled. "I just couldn't stand unfairness." But they didn't listen. They only saw a rebellious kid. The night after his loss, with the hotel lights off, McEnroe sat alone staring at his bandaged hands, tears rolling down his cheeks. He'd reached a peak millions dreamed of, yet felt empty, chillingly alone. That first success didn't make him proud. It made him afraid. "The better you are," he said, "the more people want you to fall." After Wimbledon, people talked about him not for his divine volleys, but for his anger and fiery eyes. The British press dissected him like a strange phenomenon, admired yet scorned. Some reporters called him tennis's lost child. Others said he disrespected tradition. For a boy raised with the obsession of never good enough, public disdain was the first knife to his fragile pride. McEnroe returned to America in silence. No welcome, no honors, just the feeling he'd touched something too hot to hold. Back at Port Washington, he trained harder, hit fiercer, almost maniacally. His coach told him to rest. He refused. "I don't want to stop," he said, "because when I do, I'll hear the voices in my head." Those voices were his father's, the crowds, the judgments. McEnroe turned every doubt into fuel for destruction. The next year, he won the NCAA at Stanford, then turned pro. On the court, he didn't play, he unleashed. Each forehand was revenge. each smash a shout that he deserved to exist. But the further he went, the lonelier he felt. Rivals distanced themselves, umpires grew wary, the press turned his outbursts into entertainment. At an age when others were dreaming, McEnroe lived in the glass cage of fame. His talent was a gift, but also a curse. He knew he was special, but special didn't always mean happy. "I wasn't born to be loved," he said. "I was born to be tested." Night after night, as the spotlight dimmed, he returned to cold hotel rooms, staring at his calloused hands, wondering, if people only remember my anger and not how I hit the ball, does talent even matter? That question would haunt him for life. And in that year of 1977, when the world first knew John McEnroe, he began a journey of glory and destruction, where talent ceased to be a blessing and became a curse binding his soul forever. Wimbledon 1980, the summer that held the tennis world breathless. On the lush green of center court, two men stepped out from opposite ends of the universe. Bjorn Borg, the Iceman, the stoic Swede, calm and silent, and John McEnroe, fire, the 21-year-old American, fiery, impulsive, a flame that never burned out. They were like planets on different orbits, but fate destined them to collide, creating an explosion the sports world would never forget. On July 5th, the London sky was pale gray, heavy with clouds, but no one left the stands. Borg stepped out with the serenity of a saint, the four-time defending champion. McEnroe followed, his young face burning with eyes like fire, carrying the defiance of a man who knew no fear. Cheers mixed with boos echoed through the stands. England, the cradle of tradition, was split. One side revered Borg's composure. The other was drawn to McEnroe's wild flame. From the first serves, you could feel two worlds colliding. Borg stood firm, breathing evenly, his eyes unmoved as balls whipped past, while McEnroe shouted, glared, threw his racket when calls went wrong. The crowd reacted. They booed, sneered, but couldn't look away. For despite their anger, they were mesmerized by that raw energy. McEnroe played a tennis no one had seen, fluid like jazz, pulsing with emotion. Borg, like a moving statue, struck with ruthless precision. Their contrast turned the match into a symphony, fire and ice, chaos and order, human and myth. After 3 grueling sets, McEnroe tied it 2-2, and the 4th set went to a tiebreak, where history waited. The stands fell silent. No one dared blink. McEnroe took the lead, had a chance to close it, but Borg saved it with a miraculous passing shot. Then 6-6, 8-8, 10-10, the world held its breath with them. The two fought not just with skill but with their souls. Each shot was a vow, each breath a gamble. At 13-13, McEnroe ran across the court, saving balls that seemed impossible. Sweat dripped onto the grass, mixing with morning dew. His face was drenched, his eyes ablaze. Across the net, Borg remained silent, his breathing steady, his eyes like a still lake. They said Borg played with muscle, McEnroe with heart. And in that moment, the two one-year-olds' heart beat so fast it seemed ready to burst. They battled on to 18-16, the longest tiebreak in Wimbledon history. McEnroe won that set, the crowd stood to applaud, and the world called it the immortal set. But the match wasn't over. In the 5th set, Borg surged, relentless, ruthless, while McEnroe, after nearly 4 hours, began to tremble. His nerves were taut as a wire. A final volley went into the net, and it all collapsed. Borg won 8-6, claiming his 5th straight Wimbledon title. The stadium erupted. Fans screamed Borg's name, camera flashes lit up like fireworks. Amid the noise, McEnroe stood still. He didn't look at anyone, only bowed his head, the racket in his hand drooping. His eyes were empty. On the scoreboard, his name appeared under runner-up, a haunting scar etched deep. When Borg approached to shake hands, McEnroe tried to smile, but his lips trembled and his eyes were wet. It wasn't rainwater. It was the tears of a soul that had touched heaven and then fallen. In the locker room after the match, no one spoke a word. Borg was in the next room, the sound of congratulations echoing. McEnroe sat in silence, a towel wrapped around his neck, hands gripping the racket tightly, eyes staring at the wet, tiled floor. Sweat and tears merged into a long streak on his face. "I played everything I had," he said later, "but I still lost." And in that silence, I realized that a legend is always alone. When Borg stepped up to the podium to receive the trophy, the light shone on his face like the halo of a god. All of England stood to applaud. Meanwhile, McEnroe, in the background, stood with his head bowed, his shoulders heavy. That image, one man raising the trophy high, another looking down at his shadow stretching long across the court, became a symbol of the two opposing halves in sports: victory and loss, glory and solitude. Borg would be celebrated as the perfect one, while McEnroe, the sinner with the truest heart on the grass. That year, the world saw a rebellious young man fail, but history saw a legend being born. For it was in that defeat that John McEnroe became the face of imperfection, of pride mixed with pain, something people dare not live but cannot stop loving. In 1984, John McEnroe entered the season like an uncrowned king, one the tennis world had to bow to. Stepping onto the court, he wasn't just the world's #1 player, he was a storm of perfection, an artist playing with emotion rather than muscle, a madman turning the grass into a stage. That year, McEnroe won 82 matches and lost only 3, an unreal statistic no one in the Open era has ever matched. He claimed Wimbledon, the US Open, and a slew of other titles, defeating the best opponents with tennis both delicate and ruthless. People no longer called him bad boy, but genius. Yet every genius pays a price. After each dazzling match, McEnroe didn't celebrate with anyone. He returned to his hotel room, drew the curtains tight, sat under the dim yellow light, and turned on the TV with no sound. His body was exhausted, but his mind never stopped. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the stands, the lights, the shots he'd just played. It replayed like a movie he couldn't turn off. Stress built up, and anger became part of his survival mechanism. "I had to go crazy to feel alive," he admitted years later. Behind the cold face on the court was a man slowly cracking, the pressure to win every match, maintain his image, and prove he deserved the genius label turned him into a prisoner of his own glory. In June that year, at Roland Garros, McEnroe faced Ivan Lendl in the final. He led by 2 sets, inching toward the one Grand Slam title he still lacked. But then, something in him broke. As Lendl fought back, McEnroe lost control, yelling, arguing with the umpire, talking to himself mid-court. The Paris crowd booed and jeered, and he grew more chaotic. His shots lost precision, his arm trembled. The 3rd set, then the 4th, slipped away like a nightmare. In the final set, McEnroe lost not because of technique, but because of himself. When the last ball went out, he stood frozen, eyes wide as if he couldn't believe what had happened. Lendl approached to shake hands, while McEnroe stared at the ground, lips trembling, unable to speak. Later, recalling it, he said slowly, "I beat the world, but I lost to myself." That loss was the first crack in the perfect wall he'd built. And like all cracks, it spread silently but unstoppable. McEnroe left the court in silence. In the locker room, he spoke to no one, just sat staring into a mirror. The reflection showed a man who had everything and lost everything. Dark circles under his eyes, sweat dripping down his collar, lips pressed tight. He punched the wall, then slumped down. The locker room's pale light glowed, and the distant sound of the crowd's applause for the winner echoed. To McEnroe, each clap was a knife to the heart. He craved silence, but silence never came. From then on, every match, even wins, felt like falling. People saw McEnroe grow more volatile, reacting harshly, irrationally angry. He began losing sleep, some nights staying awake just listening to his heartbeat. The pressure made his hands shake slightly, his neck stiffen, and headaches plagued him. Doctors urged rest. He gave a wry smile. If I stop, I'll collapse. The more he won, the more he feared failure, and that fear eroded the joy of victory. Behind every triumph was exhaustion. The media called McEnroe the saddest winner in the world. Those close to him said that once, after winning a major title, he returned to his hotel room, said nothing, and sat in the dark for 3 hours. When asked, he only said, "I don't know why I keep going." His talent had carried him to the top, but also dragged him into an abyss. The spotlight lit his face, but burned his soul bit by bit. The night after losing to Lendl, McEnroe sat alone in a Paris hotel room, curtains drawn, hallway light slipping through a crack, casting a thin glow on the wall. The city's noise faded. He removed his wristband, tossed it to the floor, then bowed his head, hands on his forehead. Images flooded back the booing crowd, mocking press, judgments, his father's voice in his head saying, "Never lose." He stood, walked to the white wall, and gently pressed his forehead against it. First came breathing, then sobs. Unable to bear it, he banged his head against the wall, as if to drown out the applause of the crowd that once cheered him. To him, that sound was no longer glory, it was a burden. In that room, tennis's genius sat curled up, trembling, and for the first time, John McEnroe feared what he had become. John McEnroe's body began to rebel early, long before he'd admit it. It was the price every genius pays when passion exceeds the body's limits. In 1982, the Davis Cup, a tournament McEnroe saw as America's pride, became a physical and mental ordeal he hadn't anticipated. His match against Sweden's Mats Wilander in Street Louis lasted 6 hours and 22 minutes, a grueling test of body and mind, still remembered as the craziest match in Davis Cup history. Two young men, two different worlds, trapped in the same obsession, never lose. By the third set, McEnroe felt his left thigh cramp, his hands stiffen after each volley, sweat streaming, eyes blurring from dehydration. Yet he kept going. Each time Wilander scored, McEnroe roared, threw his racket, then forced himself to be stronger. His throat burned, his breath sharp like knives in his lungs, but he played on. A familiar voice echoed in his head, his father's, the crowd's, the fear of being forgotten. Asterisk. Don't stop. Don't let them think you're weak. Asterisk. Past the 4-hour mark, his arm trembled uncontrollably. Each serve stabbed his shoulder, but to him, pain became fuel. He wasn't playing to beat Wilander anymore, he was playing to prove he still existed. Each cheer from the crowd made him feel alive. Each boo drove him to hit harder, as if he needed their scorn to stay balanced. When the final point ended, McEnroe collapsed on the court, body cramping. He won, but the victory felt more like a wound than glory. Teammates helped him to the locker room. The doctor rushed in, checked his pulse, gave him fluids, and froze when he began vomiting blood. "If you keep playing like this," the doctor said, "your spine won't hold up. One day, you won't get up." McEnroe just looked at him, gave a tired smile. "If I stop, they'll forget me." That night, he lay in his hotel room, body aching too much to move. Each breath was a cut, but his mind replayed the crowd's applause. He didn't know if he loved or hated that sound, only that he was addicted to it. Addicted to being noticed, cheered, criticized, hated anything to be times seen asterisk. To McEnroe, silence was the real enemy. The next day, he woke in searing back pain but went to practice. When an assistant asked why, he said, "I don't play tennis, I fight myself." And he did. Tennis was no longer a sport for McEnroe. It was an endless internal war between belief and fear. Each shot was a clash between the frail human and the legendary shadow he was forced to carry. The physical pain became a metaphor for his mental wounds. His aching spine was a warning, but he ignored it. To McEnroe, pain meant he was alive, feeling, remembered. He once said, "I don't know what rest is, When I'm not playing, I feel empty, like my soul's been stripped. It was the confession of a man who'd lost the concept of peace. In the years that followed, the toll mounted. Neck pain, stiff shoulders, back injuries, chronic insomnia. But instead of stepping back, McEnroe dove deeper into competition. Experts called him a man of extremes, an artist one moment, a storm of rage the next. He lived between two poles, worshipped and cursed. Once, after a 5-set match, McEnroe sat in the medical room, hands trembling, eyes closed. His coach asked if he needed rest. He replied, "Rest for what? I've got nowhere to go." It wasn't bravado, it was the raw truth of a man who only knew how to live on the court. There, he had crowds, noise, existence. Beyond it, only silence. A silence he could never endure. Borg retired in 1983 at 26, stepping away from the spotlight. McEnroe understood but couldn't follow. "I was jealous of him," he said. "Borg could leave and still be at peace. If I stop, I'll turn to ash." That was the real tragedy, when a man could no longer tell glory from pain. Years later, past 60, McEnroe still vividly recalled the 1982 Davis Cup. He called it the match that took the rest of my youth. After that day, he was never the same. His body slowed, grew heavier, but his heart still raced. That contradiction would torment him for the rest of his life. In the memory of those who witnessed it, the image of McEnroe collapsing on the St. Louis court, still clutching his racket, perfectly captured his soul, stubborn, proud, but deeply wounded. A man who played until blood came from his mouth, not for points, but for fear that stopping would make the world stop saying his name. That night in street, Louis, the cheers of thousands blended with his erratic heartbeat, a sound that was both reward and sentence for the life of a genius who couldn't stop. In 1990, John McEnroe entered the Australian Open as a stranger in the world he once ruled. His body was betraying him. Back pain, stiff shoulders, reflexes half a second slower, but what scared him most wasn't his physical decline. It was the feeling that the crowd no longer feared him. New names like Edberg, Becker, and Lendl were now the focus. McEnroe, once the spark that set every court ablaze, was now just an old legend to younger fans. He arrived in Melbourne carrying his remaining pride and a gnawing unease no one understood. The tournament unfolded in January's brutal heat. McEnroe reached the 4th round, facing Mikael Pernfors, a lesser-known Swede. Everyone expected an easy win, but in the midday swelter, another storm brewed inside McEnroe, not on the court, but within. After a few unforced errors, he began glaring at the umpire, curses slipping out uncontrollably. The chair umpire asked him to stay calm. In a blind moment of rage, McEnroe approached the net, pointed, and yelled, "Are you kidding me?" His voice echoing across the stands like the cry of a cornered animal. That scene, in an era when tennis was tightening its disciplinary rules, was unacceptable. One warning, then two, and at the third, the umpire declared, "Default." The stadium fell silent, then erupted in boos. McEnroe stood frozen for seconds, his face stone. He'd just been disqualified the first time a legend was ejected from a Grand Slam for misconduct. The next day's papers called it American Tennis's Disgrace. TV replayed his pointing and yelling dozens of times, turning a moment of anger into a public verdict. McEnroe left the court, head down, silent. He walked past the jeering crowd, past cameras aimed at his face, past looks of pity and contempt. A man once hailed as a god now walked like a criminal. In the locker room, no one dared approach. McEnroe sat, opened a water bottle, then hurled it at the wall, water splashing everywhere. "They wanted to see me fall," he whispered, "and they got their wish." Back at the hotel, he didn't turn on the light. The room was dead quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioner and his heavy breathing. He looked in the mirror, his sweat-soaked, angry face staring back. Then, for reasons he didn't understand, he punched the mirror. Glass shattered. shards cutting his hand, blood dripping onto the carpet. McEnroe sank to the floor, a bitter smile, feeling both pain and emptiness. "Who am I?" he asked himself, "when no one fears me anymore?" From childhood, he'd lived in a world where others' fear measured his power. Now, with the crowd turning away, he realized that fear was gone, leaving him exposed and lost. That night, McEnroe drank alone, small sips, not to get drunk but to quiet the noise in his head. Scattered on the nightstand were a few sedatives. He looked at them, gave a bitter laugh. Medicine for the body or the soul. No one knocked, no one called. The world outside was still buzzing about McEnroe's ejection. In that room, a man sat wondering if he was still human. "That was the day I died inside," he later recalled, "and started living again as a normal person." It sounded like a confession, but also the end of an era. At dawn, McEnroe looked out the window, light filtering through thin curtains. On the street, passers-by laughed and talked, none recognizing him. For the first time in years, he felt something strange relief. No cheers, no boos, just silence. A cruel but real silence. He stood, bandaged his bleeding hand, tossed the bottle in the trash, and sat, exhaling. The genius had fallen. But in those ashes, a man was slowly born. Not a legend, not a rebel, just a human. Frail, aware of his limits. In the solitude of that hotel room, John McEnroe, for the first time, learned to be silent. After the fall of 1990, the spotlight slowly dimmed, and John McEnroe drifted out of the glow he once commanded. The 1990 seconds opened like a new chapter with no script, where this legend grappled to understand who he was without the court, without the crowd's cheers, without the fear or awe in others' eyes. His body, worn down by nearly 2 decades, was now riddled with aches. His spine throbbed dully, his shoulders lost flexibility, and the fingers once soft as velvet stiffened. He still tried to return, playing smaller tournaments, joining exhibition matches, but the audience didn't come to watch him compete. They came to see what was left of the rebel of old. And McEnroe, though he tried to seem unfazed, felt a sting each time someone said, "He used to be great." The word "used" cut like a knife. Unable to live without a stage, he sought himself elsewhere. McEnroe started a small rock band, playing guitar and singing songs about loneliness, youth, and the exhaustion of glory. But each time he stepped onto a music stage, the crowd still shouted, "Bad boy of tennis," as if he could never escape the label the world had pinned on him. He also opened an art gallery in Manhattan, showcasing contemporary works, trying to craft an image of a man who loved art more than anger. But all these efforts seemed futile. People didn't see McEnroe, they saw a fallen legend pretending to be ordinary. Those years he spoke little, often frowned, and rarely truly smiled. In a rare interview, when asked if he missed the court, McEnroe paused for a long time before saying, "Without applause, I can't hear myself living." The words bared his soul, a man addicted to emotion, to pressure, to attention, so much that when the world fell silent, he lost his own rhythm. The media called him a prisoner of his own glory. And indeed, McEnroe was no longer an athlete, nor an artist, but a shadow of himself lost in the echoes of his past. Friends said he grew irritable, restless, sometimes sitting for hours staring out a window. Each morning, he woke asking, "What do I do now?" A simple question that, for a man who lived in the cycle of fame, became a bottomless pit. Some nights, he drank alone, watching old tapes of his younger self, hearing the cheers, the arguments, the "you cannot be serious," as if that was the only way to know he'd once existed. But when the screen went dark and the room sank into silence, he felt fear of that silence, fear of the normalcy he'd never learned to accept. Once, a close friend asked if he had regrets. McEnroe gave a sad smile. "No, but sometimes I wish I'd known how to slow down, how to love myself before it all fell apart." It was a rare, gentle, raw confession from a man who'd touched every peak but lost the simplest thing, peace. He tried returning to tennis in small roles, coaching kids, playing exhibitions, but each comeback was fleeting, as if the court no longer recognized its former master. By the late 1990s, McEnroe was in his 40s, hair flecked with gray, eyes deeper, yet the loneliness lingered. He once said, "I'm not afraid of aging. I'm afraid of becoming invisible." That, perhaps, was the greatest tragedy of every genius. They live by others' light, and when it fades, they don't know where to go in the dark. For McEnroe, the 1,990 seconds weren't decline but punishment, slow, silent, relentless. A man who once made the world roar now had to learn to hear himself in silence. And in the night wind blowing through his small Manhattan apartment, the man who was once tennis's furious soul sat quietly by the window, gazing at distant lights, wondering, would anyone still remember him, not as a legend, not as the bad boy, but as John, a man trying to find his own breath again. In the late 1,980 seconds, amid fading fame and a weary soul, John McEnroe met Tatum O'Neal, the Oscar-winning actress who'd claimed the award at 10, a woman with fragile beauty and eyes heavy with a sadness that seemed to carry the weight of the world. They met at a New York party, amid music, lights, and people fleeing themselves. McEnroe was instantly drawn. Tatum was his mirror, famous too young, worshipped too much, carrying a loneliness no trophy could erase. To Tatum, among men who saw her as an icon, McEnroe was the only one who scared her because he saw the cracks she tried to hide. Two tired souls found each other like drowning people clutching for air, not knowing their grip would pull them both under faster. Their early years were ablaze, vivid, impulsive, fierce. They fled Hollywood, the tennis courts, everything that defined them. But the light they created was the same fire that burned them. Tatum, raised in a broken, addicted family, carried unhealable wounds. McEnroe bore a lifetime of pressure, a suppressed ego, and fear of being forgotten. They loved with desperation, a thirst to be understood, to be saved, but neither had the strength to save the other. "We loved like two drowning people," he said later, "and pulled each other down faster." The press hounded them, dubbing them New York's craziest couple. Every fight was headline fodder, exaggerated, fabricated. McEnroe's famed temper met Tatum's vulnerability, turning their home into a battlefield. Nights of arguments left broken dishes, tears, and by morning they'd laugh, apologize, embrace as if nothing happened. But the cracks grew quietly. McEnroe's insomnia returned, haunted by old obsessions, applause, pressure, loneliness. Tatum, more fragile, turned to sedatives, then heroin. McEnroe tried to help, but the more he tried, the worse it got. "I thought if I loved her enough, I could save her," he said. "I was wrong. You can't save someone when you're breaking yourself." By the early 1,990 seconds, their marriage was chaos. Tatum spiraled, disappearing, entering rehab, relapsing. McEnroe, mentally drained, saw his career slump and family fracture. Some days, he'd drop the kids at school, return to an empty apartment, stare at their wedding photo, and ask, "What did I do wrong? Or did I never know how to love, right?" Their love, once a refuge, became a prison. Both were trapped in their pasts, he in unrelenting anger, she in addiction and trauma. In 1994, they divorced. The media called it America's loudest breakup. McEnroe stayed silent, avoiding interviews. Tatum vanished for a time, later admitting she'd sunk so deep into heroin she no longer recognized herself. McEnroe, though winning custody of the kids, didn't see it as a victory. "I only had the kids left," he said, "and an emptiness nothing could fill." He spent most days at home, cooking, cleaning, driving the kids to school, small tasks that made him feel useful. But at night, when the kids slept, he sat in the dark living room, staring at a cracked family photo, feeling his heart like an empty room full of memories. No warmth. He never forgot the day he left the courthouse, McEnroe holding his young daughter, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, him staring straight ahead, silent. He won, but his eyes were sadder than ever. "I had my kids but lost love," he recalled. In that moment, I understood some victories break you more than defeats. After the divorce, McEnroe fell into a quiet period. He avoided the press, lost interest in tennis and music. Once he said, "I thought I could do anything, win every match, save everyone, keep it all together. Then I learned sometimes you have to let things fall apart to survive." Tatum drifted away, each carrying half of a once blazing love. And in that cold New York night, McEnroe sat alone in his empty apartment, gazing at the East River, hearing the wind against the glass, telling himself, "This isn't the sound of the court anymore. This is the sound of truth." Amid the wreckage of a broken marriage and years of being lost, John McEnroe thought he'd lost everything: career, fame, faith in love. But in 1993, fate brought him Patti Smith, a rock singer with sharp eyes and a powerful voice, who'd also tasted the wounds of a glamorous life. They met at a small party in East Hampton, no fireworks, no spotlight, just two weary souls seeing each other in a noisy crowd. McEnroe, nearing 40, hair graying, eyes deep and tired. Patti carried her own cracks, but, unlike Tatum, didn't try to save him. She listened. "I don't need a hero," she once said. "I just need someone to breathe with me." That, perhaps, made McEnroe feel safe for the first time in years of storms. In 1997, they married in a small, simple ceremony. No press, no stands, no applause. Just a few close friends, candles, and a quiet vow. "We'll take it slow." McEnroe smiled. A rare, genuine smile since his youth. But peace wasn't easy. The scars of his past temper, insomnia, obsession with perfection clung like a shadow. Some nights, Patti woke to McEnroe muttering in his sleep. Dreams where he still argued with umpires, heard crowds booing. She'd gently place her hand on his chest, whispering, "You're safe, John. No one's yelling at you anymore." He'd wake, breathing hard, drenched in sweat, looking at her with the eyes of a child escaping a nightmare. Patti didn't try to change him, she taught him to live with himself. "You don't have to be perfect," she said, "just be here." Slowly, McEnroe learned to let go of the past, even a little. He stopped trying to control everything, stopped letting anger define him. "Patti taught me to breathe again," he said. She was the first rhythm after years of just noise. She brought him quiet mornings, making coffee, playing soft music, dropping the kids at school, walking the dog together. Those small moments, once a luxury, became miracles. But the darkness didn't vanish easily. Sometimes, McEnroe snapped over trivial things: a broken glass, a wrong news report, an article about his past. Patti stayed silent, didn't argue. She knew he was still the boy who never heard praise, only fought to be seen. "You don't have to shout to be noticed anymore," she'd say. "We see you." Sometimes, he'd rest his head on her shoulder, silent, because words felt small against her kindness. In later years, he became a devoted father, something his younger self never knew how to be. He read bedtime stories to his young daughter, his voice low, slightly hoarse. Her laughter softened him. Sometimes, it blended with memories like the sound of a ball hitting the practice court long ago, echoing then fading into the wind. Some afternoons, McEnroe sat in the backyard, tapping a ball with his racket, not to compete, just to feel life's rhythm. "I used to think noise was proof of existence," he said. "Now I know silence can be happiness too." Yet, even with family's light, the darkness never fully left. McEnroe still had sleepless nights, startled awake, mornings staring in the mirror at a stranger. "Family saved me," he admitted, "but it didn't erase the dark. It just made me strong enough to live with it." Patti understood and didn't try to fix everything. She held his hand through rainy seasons, tempers, silences. In a rare interview, McEnroe said, "I lost so much youth, career, love, fame, but when I see my kids smile, I know I found what matters most: peace in my heart, and perhaps One evening in Manhattan, as he sat on the sofa, Patty leaning on his shoulder, the kids laughing in the next room, McEnroe realized for the first time he didn't need a crowd, a trophy, or anyone's approval. Just being there, in that fragile but real light, was the greatest victory he'd ever had. As the darkness in his soul began to settle, John McEnroe realized there was one thing he'd never done in his life: speak the truth. More than 2 decades after his frenzied years, the world still saw him as a rebellious genius, a stubborn man, unrepentant. But inside the man past 40 was an exhaustion he could no longer hide. He began to tell his story not for the press, but for himself. In his 2002 memoir Times You Cannot Be Serious*, McEnroe laid bare what he'd once denied: that he'd used cocaine, lost his way in fame, lived under the illusion of invincibility. "I never thought I was addicted," he wrote. "But if you need an excuse to not feel terrible, you're already addicted." Those raw, painful words weren't from a man seeking justification, but a confession from someone weary of his own legend. When the book came out, the media exploded. Headlines screamed, "McEnroe admits drug use. Tennis legend destroys own reputation." Some criticized, others pitied. But McEnroe no longer hid. He took interviews, head high, voice slow but firm. "I spent my life blaming umpires, opponents, pressure. But the truth is, the fault was in me." Those words rang like a baptism, not just for the audience, but for himself. When asked, "Did you ever use steroids?" McEnroe didn't dodge. "I never injected anything," he replied. "But if anyone thinks I was perfect, they're wrong. I made mistakes, and I'll live with them." In middle age, he no longer cared about image, only truth. "When you spend your life playing the rebel, at some point you don't know who you are anymore," he said. "I'm tired. I just want to be human." His honesty stunned the public. They were used to a McEnroe who screamed at umpires, smashed rackets, raged at the world. Now here was a calm man in a studio, voice hoarse, eyes sunken, speaking of mistakes with relief. For perhaps the first time, he wasn't trying to win or prove anything. He just wanted forgiveness, not from others, but from himself. Patti Smith stood behind him in that phase, quietly his anchor. "He lived in a shell too thick," she said, "and breaking it hurt." Patti urged him to face, not flee. McEnroe listened, and for the first time, he agreed to a TV show, not to commentate tennis, but to talk about life. He spoke of sleepless nights, the fear of hearing crowds jeer in his dreams, the emptiness of victory. "If you have to destroy yourself to become a legend," he said, "is it worth it?" In the early 2000s, McEnroe began reshaping his image. No longer the bad boy of tennis, he became the old man of truth, a symbol of maturity after the storm. He hosted shows, commentated, sometimes joking wryly about his past. "If social media existed back then," he quipped, "I'd have been canceled after one set." But behind the humor was a deep awareness of mistakes that couldn't be undone. Many admired him for facing himself, but McEnroe found it harder to accept himself than anyone else did. At a talk at Stanford, where he'd once studied, a student asked, "If you could go back, what would you change?" McEnroe paused long before answering, "I'd learn to be silent. Because sometimes, just being silent, you don't hurt anyone." The room fell quiet, not for grand words, but for the simple truth carrying a lifetime of regret. Still, McEnroe didn't let regret consume him. He chose to keep living, playing exhibitions, coaching kids, raising charity funds. He visited youth camps, sharing his story, teaching them to face pressure and failure. "I want kids to know no one's perfect," he said, "even those they think are legends." Each child's smile healed a piece of him. In a late 2000s interview, McEnroe looked into the camera, voice soft but clear. "I used to think tennis was everything. Now I know it was just a mirror reflecting me, a distorted, cracked mirror. But if you look closely through the cracks, you see the truth." And perhaps that was what he sought his whole life, not perfection, but truth. At an age when many cling to nostalgia to escape, McEnroe chose to confront. He didn't deny his past, didn't beg forgiveness, just admitted even legends can lose their way. And in the faint light of a New York dusk, the man who once shouted amid thousands now smiled when asked if he was happy. "I don't know," he said, "but for the first time, I don't need to shout to hear myself." As his glory days on the court faded, John McEnroe found a new stage, not wielding a racket but a microphone. From the bad boy booed by crowds, he became the voice of the game, a voice millions of tennis fans worldwide awaited each Grand Slam. Once screaming at umpires, he now sat calmly in the booth, analyzing every shot, mistake, and emotion of young players, but his voice still carried that sharp, sardonic, inimitable edge. Once, seeing a player smash a racket in anger, he chuckled, "That kid reminds me of someone who made the same mistake, except that guy's now talking through a mic." The broadcast room laughed. McEnroe smiled, but his eyes held a flicker of sadness, the smile of a man who'd lived fully in the storm and was now just its narrator. He didn't tame his personality. He was still McEnroe, sharp, stubborn, sometimes harsh. But now, beneath the biting tone was experience, the heart of a man who'd been through it all. Viewers began to see what they'd once blindly denied. Behind the anger was rare sensitivity. McEnroe understood the game like a symphony. He knew when the music should rise, when it should fall. His commentary wasn't just tactics, it was life philosophy. You can't control the crowd, the weather, even your emotions, but you can control the next shot. His words on air were both sports advice and a confession from a soul once ruled by rage. Fans grew to love him differently. They no longer waited for outbursts, but listened to his silences. When he saw in a young player the confusion he once felt, "I see myself in those kids," he said. "They're scared, want to be loved, don't know how to show it right." His voice, though sometimes gruff, became a symbol of honesty, raw, unfiltered, saying what others feared. In a sports world increasingly polished, he was the scratch that made it real, yet every light casts a shadow. In a 2010 interview, McEnroe admitted, "When you talk about others every day, you start fearing what they say about you." The words seemed light, but held the loneliness of a man who'd spent a lifetime analyzing, judging, now afraid of being judged back. Each day after commentating, as the booth lights dimmed and the stands emptied, he sat alone, staring at the old court. The noise of youth lingered in memory, cheers, boos, arguments, the sound of the ball. Now, it was just a distant echo. He admitted, sometimes after broadcasts, he'd wander the courts like a sleepwalker, touching the net, staring at empty seats. "I miss that noise," he said softly. "Even though it drove me crazy back then." Patty understood that emptiness. "John's still an artist," she said, "just painting with words now." And indeed, McEnroe commentated like he was playing an instrument, witty, soulful, sometimes bursting with emotion. Those who once hated him now found comfort in his voice. In it was guilt, regret, and ultimately compassion. The man who once shouted, "You cannot be serious!" to the world now used that voice to teach patience with humanity. He still mentioned old mistakes, not to justify, but to laugh wryly at them. "If you've never lost control, maybe you've never been truly passionate," he said during a Wimbledon broadcast. The quip made millions chuckle, but amid the laughter was empathy. McEnroe had redeemed his past with honesty, turning yesterday's rage into today's gentle music. And then, as night fell after each match day, he left the booth, walking past empty seats. The cold wind whispered through the stands like echoes of the past. McEnroe paused, looked at the scoreboard where his name once shone in bright letters. Now, it held only the meaningless marks of another match. He smiled, rested his hand on the railing, let the wind carry his breath, and said softly, "I used to shout to be heard. Now I speak so others don't feel alone." In that moment, amid empty stands, the man who once terrified the world became the game's gentlest voice. Not a shout, not a judgment, but the sound of forgiveness for others and for himself. When his voice became a staple of Grand Slams, John McEnroe began thinking about what he'd leave behind. Not titles, not records, but a different legacy, one that could heal the past. In 2010, on Randall's Island in the heart of New York, where he'd trained as a boy, the John McEnroe Tennis Academy, JMTA, was born. Not a factory for champions, but a place where he wanted kids to play tennis for joy, for freedom, not the fear of failure he'd carried. "I don't need to create another McEnroe," he said at the opening. "I just want to help kids avoid what I went through." From the start, the academy felt different. No yelling, no pressure to win. McEnroe told coaches to teach students to laugh while hitting, to lose without self-loathing. On the wall, he hung a large sign, "Don't let anger be louder than joy." At practices, he'd stand back, watching kids run across the court, their laughter echoing, and he'd smile faintly. Perhaps for the first time, he saw tennis not as a battlefield but a place where people could be loved. Still, darkness lingered in the deepest corners of his soul. Once, a young student cried mid-practice after losing an internal set. McEnroe walked over, put a hand on the boy's shoulder, and said softly, "It's okay, kid. I was that boy once." The court fell silent. These weren't a legend's words, but those of a man who knew victory could kill childhood. He hugged the boy, as if hugging his 12-year-old self. The kid scolded for not being good enough. In that moment, teacher and student both wept. JMTA became a place where McEnroe not only taught but healed. Each day, walking through its gates, he felt like a boy again, but this time, without fear. He trained with students, shared stories, even played guitar for them on weekends. Their laughter mended pieces of his soul. "I never thought I'd be a teacher," he said, "but teaching them helped me forgive the kid in me." He often shared his mistakes with students, not to boast, but to remind them even the greatest were frail. "If you ever feel like smashing your racket," he'd say, "think of me, I did it for everyone already." The court laughed, but the laughter held warmth. This wasn't the McEnroe of the 1,980 seconds, shouting amid thousands, but a man who listened, who smiled at imperfection. The academy had talent, but McEnroe always told coaches, "Don't turn them into winning machines. Teach them to lose without losing faith." Seeing a child stare at a scoreboard with disappointed eyes, he'd recall himself at Wimbledon 1,980, those empty eyes of a loser who hadn't learned to accept. Tennis, to him, was no longer about winning but about humanity. Yet, behind each lesson, each smile, were nights when McEnroe sat alone in the academy's office, gazing at the river, hearing balls bounce outside. His body was tired. His calloused hands trembled slightly. On the desk, among photos of students, was an old picture of him at 18 at Wimbledon, eyes defiant, proud, untired. He'd stare at it, then say softly, "I teach them calm, something I never learned my whole life." Sometimes, at day's end, he'd quietly step onto the court, hitting a few balls with a young coach. The setting sun cast his shadow long across the court. The ball's sound light, steady, carried no anger, only breath. Students saw him, shouting, "Coach John! Coach John!" He'd smile, wave, his eyes glinting with a gentle light he'd never known before. The John McEnroe Tennis Academy wasn't just an academy, it was his belated apology to the past, to his parents, to the boy inside who grew up in silence and fear. And in the echo of a ball at dusk, the man who once lived on rage finally found a way to breathe slow, deep, and peaceful. Time, the final opponent John McEnroe could never defeat, quietly shadowed him daily. At 66, the man who once terrified the world with his rage and extraordinary talent now faced limits even his will couldn't overcome. Each morning, before leaving bed, he took minutes just to stand steady. His back ached like an old song that never stops. His hand trembled slightly holding the racket. His hearing faded, making the ball's thud on the court less sharp than before. Sleep came fitfully, short and unfamiliar, often interrupted by noisy memories of the past. The crowd's roars, the snap of a broken racket, his own shouts from the days as the bad boy of tennis. Now, waking in the middle of the night, he found only a dark, heartbreakingly quiet room. McEnroe kept working, still a commentator, still teaching at his academy, still joking with kids as if time hadn't touched him. But only he knew each morning began with small pains, slow movements, and the creak of his back, a reminder that even legends are flesh and bone. He still went to the academy, walked the courts, corrected students' stances, told them, "Relax, don't try to be perfect," though he'd never managed that himself. "I can't sit still," he said. "When I do, I start hearing time pass." His old friends who together shaped tennis's golden era were also fading from the spotlight. Björn Borg, once the other half of the fire and ice legend, now lived quietly in Sweden, battling heart issues and the weariness of age. Jimmy Connor's rival, foe, friend retired silently, rarely seen in public. Ivan Lendl retreated to coaching kids, occasionally texting McEnroe to wish him well. Thinking of them, McEnroe felt a pang not for lost glory, but for realizing he was part of a fading generation, where those once immortal were quietly slipping into dusk. During Wimbledon commentary, he'd sit in the booth, watching young players below, and sigh softly. "We were myths once," he told a colleague. "Now we're just old men trying to forget the applause." The room fell silent. No one responded, for they all knew behind the self-mockery was an unmaskable sadness. McEnroe was still sharp, still witty, but sometimes he'd pause mid-sentence, forgetting a player's name or the year he won a title. He'd laugh it off, but his eyes drifted far away. "I was never afraid of aging," he said. "I'm just afraid of forgetting what it felt like to live fully." Patty stayed by him, gentle and patient. She made coffee each morning, prepared painkillers, reminded him to walk slowly. Some days, McEnroe sat in the backyard, reading the paper, eyes lingering on news of an old colleague's passing, staying silent for a long time. "We traveled the world," he said, "played matches that made crowds cry, laugh, cheer. Now all that's left are old photos, blurry memories, and a body that won't listen." Yet his voice held no resentment, only the pride of someone who'd lived every second fully. Each Wimbledon, McEnroe returned to center court not to play, but to commentate. Passing the hallway where his name was etched on the honor board, he'd slowly touch it, as if grazing a piece of memory. On the court, fans still cheered his name, but now with respect, not fear. McEnroe bowed his head, smiled a strangely serene smile. He told a reporter, "I used to think I was born to fight the world. Now I just want to listen to it." His body weakened, but his gaze remained sharp, a gentle fire in his eyes, not of anger, but of memory. He'd joke, "I used to smash rackets because I couldn't control my emotions. Now I just hope I can still lift one." Then he'd laugh, hoarse but warm. The kids at the academy saw not age, but the figure of a man who dared to live fully, dared to err, regret, change. Some nights, after Patty slept, McEnroe sat in the living room, playing an old video, the 1980 Wimbledon final, the 1816 tiebreak, the thunderous cheers. He sat silently, eyes misty, lips moving as if replaying each volley in his mind. His heartbeat merged with the ball's rhythm, slow, trembling, then stilled in silence. When the screen went dark, he saw his reflection, gray hair, stooped shoulders, a face etched with time, but eyes still bright. The same gaze of the two one-year-old who challenged the world. Time took his youth, but not his grit. At 66, McEnroe was no longer the court's legend. He was a symbol of endurance, of healing, of a man who learned to accept himself after a lifetime of rebellion. When a reporter asked if he still remembered the feeling of victory, he smiled faintly. "Now, every morning I can get up, take a deep breath, and see the sun that's enough to call a win." At a New York dusk, he still walked the academy courts, back slightly bent, steps slow but steady. The distant sound of balls and children's laughter echoed. He paused, listened, closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "That noise, it's still here." His voice trembled, mixed with pride and regret. Though the light faded, McEnroe held a quiet pride, that of a warrior who'd been through it all and still stood, if only to hear the echo of a time long gone. On a late autumn afternoon in Manhattan, faint sunlight fell on the backyard court of the McEnroe family's small home. The day's last rays slid through the trees, lighting the white baseline like a thin thread connecting past and present. John McEnroe, 66, in an old tracksuit, holding a worn-out racket, faced his young daughter. Each gentle swing, each ball's bounce on the court, sounded soft, not the thunder of old, but the steady breath of a heart that had learned to be still. The girl laughed as she missed, the ball sailing over the fence. McEnroe smiled, walked slowly, picked it up, and said, half joking, half true, "It's okay. That shot was still better than any I ever hit." She looked up, laughing in the sunlight, and he, the man who once made the world bow with his talent and tremble at his rage, felt only gratitude for still holding a racket, for sharing this game with someone he loved. "I'm not angry anymore," he said, voice low and hoarse. "I'm just grateful to be here, hearing the ball, seeing the light." As he looked up, a breeze stirred, carrying the rustle of leaves, and in that moment, the past flooded back like an old film. The roaring crowd of Center Court 1980, Wimbledon's blazing lights, the cheers, the boos, the shout of, "You cannot be serious," all returned in a flash. Then Borg appeared, sweat on his brow, the quiet smile of a victor, and a respectful look for the defeated. Memory blended with the present, his daughter's giggles on the court, the ball's bounce, the wind. McEnroe stood between two worlds, one of youth's blazing glory, the other of age's quiet peace. He walked to the baseline, legs trembling slightly, wiping a bead of sweat from his cheek, not from exertion, but emotion. "Strange," he said. "I spent my life fighting opponents, umpires, myself, only to realize the most important thing isn't winning, but having someone still want to play with you when the lights go out." His daughter served again, the ball veering off, but McEnroe moved to meet it, a light volley landing softly, perfectly. She cheered, and he laughed. "That," he said, "was a perfect shot, not for points but for joy." As the afternoon faded, their shadows stretched across the court. McEnroe paused, looking at the racket, once a weapon, a burden, a symbol, now just part of his body, his memory. He turned it, feeling the strings vibrate in his palm, reviving him not with past anger, but with gratitude. "I spent my life shouting at the universe to be heard," he whispered. "And now, when it's silent, I finally hear myself." His daughter ran to hug him, the smell of sweat and sun mingling. He gently touched her hair, looking at the sky turning purple-blue. In that moment, all noise, echoes, and glory dissolved, leaving only the warmth of family, of now. He understood that, no matter the years, a person is just a child seeking love, forgiveness, peace with themselves. McEnroe placed the final ball in his palm, tossed it lightly, swung slowly. The ball rose, fell, rolled past the white line, stopping at the court's edge. He watched, walked over, picked it up, hand trembling, voice soft in the breeze. "You cannot be serious?" "No, I finally am." The phrase, once a symbol of rebellion, now a quiet affirmation of a life that learned honesty. He sat on a chair, dusk settling on his face, wrinkles deep but eyes clear. In his mind, past sounds echoed crowd applause, rivals calling his name, the racket striking the ball, and somewhere, his father's stern voice, his mother's silence, all merged into the sweet stillness of dusk. McEnroe was no longer the bad boy, the legend, the icon, just a man who'd weathered every loss to learn that peace was the ultimate reward. As the light dimmed, his daughter took his hand, pulling him inside. McEnroe stood, glancing back at the court one last time. The white lines, once his battlefield, now lay calm like an old page, where every shout, tear, and rage had become memory. He nodded slightly, as if bidding farewell to himself. Then he turned, walked slowly, shoulders stooped but steps steady. In the quiet New York evening, the man who once made the world bow stepped into his small home, where children's laughter rang warm. Behind the closed door, John McEnroe's final court remained out there, not Wimbledon, not Flushing Meadows, but the space in his heart. There, fire and ice, rage and forgiveness, past and present finally became one. And as the wind blew, the ball's echo lingered in the air, soft, gentle, like the heartbeat of a soul that learned peace after a lifetime of rebellion. Perhaps what makes John McEnroe's story most haunting isn't his 7 Grand Slams or the near-perfect 1,984-82-3 season, but the cost, a soul always on the edge. In the 1816 tiebreak at Wimbledon 1,980, we saw fire and ice collide. Borg calmly lifting the trophy, McEnroe leaving with head bowed, a moment that birthed a legend and loneliness. At the 1,982 Davis Cup, he played 6 hours 22 minutes against Wilander, vomiting blood after and still saying, "I don't play tennis, I fight myself." That's the harsh truth of American glory, unyielding will blurring into self-destruction. In 1990, the default at the Australian Open branded him a national disgrace, and in a hotel room he shattered a mirror asking, "Who am I when no one fears me anymore?" We pity the McEnroe of that night, but honor him for restarting with honesty, admitting cocaine, stopping blame on umpires, declaring, "The fault was in me." His personal tragedy with Tatum O'Neal, divorce in 1994, heroine's shadow, ended with custody, a victory of duty, but a defeat of the heart. Light came late with Patti Smith, married 1,997. Patti taught me to breathe again, and JMTA 2010 was his apology to the boy inside, encouraging play for joy, hugging a crying student saying, "I was that boy once." At 66, with back pain, trembling hands, short sleep, he still teaches, commentates. Picking up a ball with his daughter, he whispers, "You cannot be serious." "No, I finally am." Lessons for Americans today. 1. Success doesn't justify losing yourself. Prioritize mental health like points. 2. Family duty outweighs applause. Winning is being a good parent. 3. Truth and apology outshine. PR4. Inspire the next generation, turn rage into compassion. And 5. In the end, victory isn't defeating others, but gratitude for still holding a racket and loving. If you feel the tearful yet radiant journey of John McEnroe, a man who learned peace after a lifetime of rebellion, please subscribe to join us in exploring more legacy stories of legends. Thank you for listening. See you in the next video, where victory lies not just on the court, but in the hearts of those who dare face themselves.